diplomats are supposed to do a lot more. They're supposed to be everywhere, do everything. But at the same time, most probably when you look at political masters, if there's cuts to be made, foreign ministers, foreign service is going to be easy targets if it's a question of diplomacy versus transportation, education, health. Who do you cut back on? So again, I think even though those four sort of challenges are huge, I think we can sort of chip away, at least in the Caribbean process, about three things that puzzle me about the Caribbean. And perhaps, even though not all four are going to be advanced, maybe one and a half would be pretty good. The first puzzle I have, and again, Andy, Professor Knight alluded to this, is why isn't there any collective sort of an external action service equivalent in the Caribbean? It would seem to me much harder for the German, for the French, for the British to combine. And of course, the logic in the Caribbean seems to be much greater for having this in terms of missions, particularly in those universal institutions that the Caribbean is supposed to focus on, to have a lot of attention, to have a lot of value on. So when there's a banana case, which I have to say I haven't sort of studied terribly closely, but the one that I have studied is this interesting case on Antigua with internet gambling. Again, internet gambling might not be to everybody's flavor normatively, but it shows the vulnerability of a small country, 70,000, when they have to rely on outsourcing commercial diplomacy because they don't have a WTO ambassador, they don't have the sort of technical knowledge in Geneva. They have to kind of commute to Geneva. This, to me, seems to be a problem. And of course, at the same time, if you did have some sort of overlay of an external action service, you could jump over the established hierarchy and have all these young, talented people, or at least a good cohort of them, doing soft power, doing high tech, doing information technology. All the things that, unless you're a very rare person high up in the hierarchy, you tend to outsource anyway to other people. So this is the first puzzle. The second puzzle is, why isn't there any sharing, or very much sharing, of actual missions overseas? Why can the Pacific Alliance in 2 or 3 years have some degree of cooperation in missions overseas, abroad? Why can Canada and Australia have some degree of cooperation in terms of using each other's physical site? Canada using Australia in Asia-Pacific, Australia using Canada in Africa. It seems to me a stretch. This isn't to go back on the wonderful stretches, particularly in countries like Trinidad and Tobago. When you look at the opening of embassies, again, I was here last year, opening of the China embassy. I believe Panama has been opened. But it's a huge stretch to compete with big countries in terms of how many missions, both embassies and consulates. In fact, it's a real problem to get the right mix of sites. Diplomacy, particularly commercial diplomacy, but also diaspora diplomacy, is not only done in capitals. You have to have a wide range. So we can see that even if embassies are opened in rising, ascendant powers, there's also a lot of cities that don't seem to be covered in terms of consulates. Again, going through the list, I mean, Shanghai, Mumbai, Sao Paulo don't seem to have consulates. And on the consulate sort of diaspora diplomacy, it's quite clear that Caribbean countries put a lot of emphasis on servicing diaspora, helping, facilitating. And of course, this isn't only a question for small countries. Mexico does the same thing, 60+ consulates. How many? I mean, I was quite amazed that Trinidad and Tobago has, 35 consulates. But still, even with that, I might be out a bit, but around that figure. But even with that, quite an impressive figure, you're still missing, even in the United States, certain key cities for not having consulates, right? If you're going to be a cultural ambassador, you've got to be in LA. If you're going to be a tech ambassador, you've got to be in San Francisco or Seattle or other countries. Maybe even you've got to be in Waterloo in Canada, in terms of a consulate. So there's lots of sort of issues in this regard. So that's my second puzzle. My third puzzle is whether there's a risk-adverse sort of nature to Caribbean diplomacy on some big issues. We had a really good presentation the first day about the offshore. But in some senses, from a diplomatic perspective, what it misses out is the tremendous pushback by many small countries on the offshore post-2008. We've seen this very impressive coalition of small countries, this 3G, global governance, led by Singapore. 3 Caribbean countries belonged, but doing interviews, certainly in New York, I never got the sense that the Caribbean countries or entities really played a leadership role in that type of initiative. Why not? If the offshore is so vital, both instrumentally and symbolically, why it's so stigmatized? Why not sort of push back on these type of issues? Again, this is my third puzzle. My fourth is less of a puzzle, but sort of an opening in the great game of not just mastery of commercial, strategic diplomacy, but cultural diplomacy, ideational diplomacy. It's a tough struggle to get your country on the map in the big countries. And more of a struggle to get it on the map, not in a negative way, but in a positive way. What could you do about this? Well, one, of course, is to have younger, culturally, technologically sophisticated ambassadors, sort of that enhance soft power. The other sort of ability, though, is to have a continuation of this type of forum, but perhaps do it in a slightly different way. One, of course, would be to have a commission of some sort. Again, we've seen lots of examples of commissions, R2P, human security, and so on. The problem with commissions, though, is that they tend to focus on problems, not on solutions. And again, in the context of the Caribbean, I think one has to be careful about focusing on issues that most probably are going to highlight some of the problems. So what I would suggest, not so much a commission, but some ways an offshoot of sort of a different form of informality. And here is probably the Clinton Global Initiative is a good example. Because of there, we not only have globally an initiative that is about talk, but people are supposed to deliver in a year's time. And again, I think given the talent that we've seen around the tables this 3 days, I think this would be a very good example. My suggestion, and of course the generic suggestion, would be the Trinidad and Tobago Caribbean Initiative. But on a personal take, the Ducaran Caribbean Initiative would be equally, I think, attractive to many of us around the table. Again, I don't expect everybody to pick up the ideas. A lot of these are just thrown out. But again, my mandate was to have things that you could act on. I think all 4 of those suggestions, or at least 3 or 2 or 1, you can act on. So thanks again for your patience so late in the day.
Thank you, Professor Cooper. Now we're going to have Dr. Obi Aginam, who is Nigerian-born Canadian. We go way back. He's going to talk about this asymmetrical diplomacy, or diplomatic asymmetries, the Caribbean and global health governance. Obi.
Thank you very much, Andy. When I was invited, Andy and I have known each other for over 10 years now, dating back to when I was teaching in Canada. When I was invited, he asked me to focus on global health diplomacy and to look for practical and pragmatic alternatives for the Caribbean in the context of emerging global diplomacy. That's a tall order. After listening to all the disruptive ideas and all the arguments and debates in the past 3 days, I would like to undertake this task by starting with a very brilliant quote from Brundtland, the former DG of the World Health Organization. She argued towards the end of her tenure as the Director General of the WHO that today, in an interconnected world, infectious diseases travel almost as fast as email and financial flows, end of quote. I think this is a very apt way to understand the impact of globalization on the crisscrossing of diseases across national boundaries. I want to expand beyond Brundtland to also link infectious diseases with the emerging and re-emerging non-communicable threats. Think of obesity, think of the tobacco epidemic, think of food security issues. These are all disease public health drivers that are not driven by health sector. They are driven by investments in trade and other economic relations. When we look at the contemporary international system, I've tried to coin two terms, asymmetrical diplomacy and diplomatic asymmetries, to explore global health diplomacy in an interconnected world and to raise the question, what should the Caribbean nations do to maximize their potentials in this evolving global health governance architecture? Asymmetries is a fact of international system. All the nation states cannot, be of the same size. We have to live with that. The so-called microstates that are concentrated in the Caribbean and the South Pacific have to think of the best ways to maximize their skills in the evolving global health the diplomatic order. So diplomacy in an interdependent world is driven by the phenomenon of globalization. These intensifying flows of ideas, people, services, finance, ICT, that affect people in different parts of the world in different ways, have also globalized a lot of, has globalized public health in very complex ways. Think about SARS, avian flu, and recently Ebola, and how each of these was actually globalized by travel, the movement of goods and services across national boundaries. Health diplomacy has undergone significant transformation, just like the international system. To use the jargon of international relations experts, we now live in a post-Westphalian order. This governance architecture is no longer driven by interstate relations. I think Professor Cooper has, he alluded to that in his presentation. We now have a range of actors, non-state